The courtroom was cold, but not because of the air conditioning. It was the kind of cold that came from the way people looked at her. Some with indifference, some with doubt, and a few with outright suspicion. Kennedy Price, just 14 years old, sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting in her lap. The orange jumpsuit she wore felt heavy on her shoulders, as if it was trying to suffocate her. But she kept her chin up. Her grandfather had taught her that much. Never show fear. Across the room, Judge Richard Calloway adjusted his glasses and exhaled loudly, as if this entire proceeding was a waste of his time. His silver hair was combed back neatly, but there was something impatient in the way he shuffled the papers in front of him. He didn't even look at Kennedy as the bailiff announced the charges: felony theft and destruction of property. The word felony felt ridiculous, but no one in the room was laughing. The prosecutor, Malcolm Reed, stood up. His suit was crisp, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant was caught on surveillance footage at Davidson and Compy Jewelry moments before the store's alarm was triggered. The footage shows her reaching into the display case. Minutes later, the store's entire security system was disabled, and a sapphire necklace worth $12,000 disappeared. We also have a witness who claims to have seen the defendant fleeing the scene." Kennedy didn't blink. She had heard this all before. Same words, same tone, same smugness. Her public defender, Thomas Lane, barely looked at her as he stood. "Your Honor, my client is 14 years old. She has no history of criminal activity, no prior offenses, none on record." Reed interjected, "We don't know what she's been up to before this." Kennedy's fingers curled into her jumpsuit. She wanted to scream, but she stayed silent. Judge Calloway sighed. "Let's not waste time. Does the defense have an argument, or are we going straight to witness testimony?" Lane shifted awkwardly, flipping through his notes. "My client was nowhere near the store when the theft occurred." Reed smirked. "That's an interesting claim. Surveillance footage suggests otherwise." Kennedy finally spoke. "Show it." The room fell silent. Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Kennedy turned her head, looking directly at Reed. "The footage. Show it." The prosecutor hesitated for half a second before nodding at the bailiff. Moments later, a screen on the courtroom wall flickered to life. Grainy black-and-white footage played, showing the inside of the jewelry store. A girl in a hoodie stepped up to the counter, her face mostly obscured. Her height, her build, it could have been Kennedy, but Kennedy knew something the rest of the room didn't. She waited. "Watch," she said, pointing at the screen. "Pause it." Calloway narrowed his eyes, but nodded. The bailiff froze the frame. Kennedy leaned forward. "Look at her left hand." The room shifted. People squinted at the screen. The judge frowned. "What about it?" Kennedy turned to the jury. "She's wearing a ring on her index finger. I don't wear rings." Lane blinked, clearly caught off guard. Reed's smirk faded. Kennedy didn't stop. "And if you rewind a few seconds, you'll notice something else. Her shoes. They're too big, and they don't match the way I walk. If you compare that to the footage from when I was arrested, you'll see a difference." Reed clenched his jaw. "Circumstantial?" Kennedy tilted her head. "That's funny, because I thought prosecutors loved surveillance footage, when it works in their favor." Calloway exhaled through his nose. He wasn't entertained, but he wasn't dismissing her either. But Kennedy wasn't finished. She had one more move to make. And this was the moment everything started to shift. Judge Calloway laced his fingers together, his expression unreadable. The courtroom had gone still, everyone waiting to see what he'd say next. "You've got quite the sharp eye, Miss Price," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "But this isn't a game of spot the difference. You're on trial for felony theft." Kennedy didn't flinch. "I know." A murmur rippled through the gallery. People weren't used to a kid speaking so confidently in a courtroom, especially not one in an orange jumpsuit. The judge sighed and looked at her attorney. "Mr. Lane, is your client's strategy to play detective? Because I have to say, that's a new one." Lane cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. No, Your Honor. We're trying to prove my client's innocence." Kennedy interrupted. "Isn't that the point of a trial?" Reed scoffed. "Cute." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to create reasonable doubt with technicalities. The fact remains, she was seen at the scene." Kennedy cut in again. "Actually, I wasn't." The prosecutor's head snapped in her direction. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you weren't there?" "I'm saying your so-called witness is wrong." Reed's lips tightened. "Our witness is a store employee who swears they saw you running from the scene." Kennedy shrugged. "Then they're lying. Or mistaken. Did they describe what I was wearing?" Reed hesitated. Kennedy turned to the jury. "Because if they said I was wearing this hoodie," she gestured to the grainy video still frozen on the screen, "then they're wrong. I don't own a hoodie like that. And if you check my arrest records, you'll see I was wearing something completely different when the police picked me up." The courtroom buzzed again. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply. "All right, enough." He looked at Kennedy, his eyes narrowing as if assessing a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. "You clearly have something to say, so let's play a little game." Kennedy crossed her arms. "A game?" "Truth or lie," the judge said. "I'll ask you some legal questions. You answer. If you're as smart as you think you are, this should be easy." Lane looked horrified. "Your Honor, I don't—" Calloway ignored him. "Ready, Miss Price?" Kennedy glanced at her grandfather in the audience. He hadn't said a word since the trial started, but his face was calm, watching, waiting. She turned back to the judge. "Go ahead." Calloway tapped his fingers on the bench. "Burden of proof in a criminal case. Who holds it?" Kennedy didn't hesitate. "The prosecution. Standard. Beyond a reasonable doubt." Calloway nodded slightly. "Miranda visa Arizona. What's its significance?" Kennedy smirked. "That's a trick question. It established the Miranda rights, but it was about more than that. It was about police coercion and the Fifth Amendment. You can't use a confession if the suspect wasn't properly informed of their rights." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Reed shifted in his seat. Calloway leaned forward. "Good. Now tell me, what's the exclusionary rule?" Kennedy didn't blink. "If evidence is obtained illegally, it can't be used in court." Mapp v. Ohio, 1961. The gallery was no longer whispering. They were staring. Calloway tapped his gavel against the bench. "One last question. If you answer this right, I'll consider taking your claims more seriously." Kennedy squared her shoulders. The judge tilted his head. "When can a minor be tried as an adult in the state of Tennessee?" A slow smile spread across Kennedy's face. "Under Tennessee law, a minor can be transferred to adult court if they're over 14, and the offense is severe enough. Armed robbery, murder, things like that. But theft?" She shook her head. "Not unless there's a serious prior record, which I don't have." Calloway didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at Reed. "Counselor, remind me, why are we treating this case like it's a felony?" Reed opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The courtroom shifted again. Kennedy had just made the judge question everything. But the prosecution wasn't going down without a fight. Reed's face hardened. He could feel the case slipping, and he wasn't about to let a 14-year-old make a fool of him. "Your Honor," he said, forcing a chuckle, "this is impressive, really, but let's not pretend this changes anything. She still fits the description. She was arrested a few blocks away. The witness saw her." Kennedy tilted her head. "The witness saw someone. But I have a question for you, Mr. Reed. When was the last time you actually listened to a witness instead of just using them?" Reed scoffed. "Excuse me?" Kennedy turned to the jury. He's counting on you to assume I'm guilty because someone thinks they saw me. But eyewitness testimony is unreliable, especially under stress. Reed shook his head. And you're an expert now? Kennedy leaned forward. I don't have to be. The Supreme Court already said it for me. Perry v. New Hampshire, 2012. They ruled that eyewitness testimony can't always be trusted, especially when there's no police misconduct to back it up. Memories change. People fill in gaps. Sometimes they just see what they expect to see. The jury was paying attention now. Kennedy could tell. Some leaned forward. A few glanced at Reed. Judge Calloway exhaled through his nose. You're saying the witness might be mistaken. I'm saying it wouldn't be the first time. Reed's jaw tightened. That's speculation. Kennedy shrugged. And so is a bad ID. She turned back to the judge. Can I ask Mr. Reed a question? Calloway glanced between them. You may. Kennedy locked eyes with the prosecutor. Where's the missing necklace? Reed's mouth twitched. The courtroom was silent. Kennedy pressed on. You have no physical evidence, no stolen property, no fingerprints, no DNA, just a grainy video and a witness who thinks they saw me, but no actual proof. Reed gritted his teeth. We don't need the necklace to prove you took it. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. You should, because last time I checked, theft means taking something. And if you don't have what was stolen, how do you know I had it? Reed's face turned red. The jury can infer. Infer? Kennedy tilted her head. So, no real evidence, then. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses. Counselor, does the state have any material evidence tying the defendant to the stolen property? Reed hesitated. We have the security footage. That doesn't clearly show her, Calloway cut in. Reed's lips parted, but no words came out. Kennedy took a slow breath. So, let me get this straight. You want to send a kid to juvenile detention over a crime you think she committed, based on a bad video and a shaky witness, with no stolen property, no real evidence, and no prior record? The words hung in the air. Reed clenched his jaw. We have enough. Kennedy let the silence stretch. Do you? No one moved. Even Calloway didn't speak for a moment. Then he shifted in his chair. I want to hear from this witness. Reed inhaled sharply. Your Honor. I said I want to hear from them, Calloway repeated, his voice steady. Kennedy's lips curled into a small smile. Because now, for the first time, the judge wasn't just looking at her like a defendant. He was looking at her like someone who might be telling the truth.